General Tedros Adhanom has been fully engaged in soliciting diplomatic and military support for the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, in many parts of the world, a top official said Monday. Tedros, who has been serving in his position at the WHO since 2017, was a member of the TPLF's powerful executive committee. He was also Ethiopia's health minister from 2005 to 2012 and foreign affairs minister from 2012 to 2016. Ethiopian government had been well aware of Tedros's activities since the beginning of the National Defense Forces law enforcement operation against the TPLF, which is entrenched in the northern Tigray region. Tedros had been lobbying the UN agencies to exert pressure on the Ethiopian government to unconditionally stop its military action against the TPLF. He noted. He was relentlessly demonizing us. The official added that Tedros had also been soliciting Egyptian military support for the TPLF to ally with Egypt, which had been bent on destabilizing Ethiopia for decades and aborting construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. GERD is tantamount to treason, he said. According to the official, who attended many high-profile government briefings on the matter, Tedros was also active in Eastern Africa. He repeatedly called top officials of many neighboring nations and pressured them to provide military and diplomatic support to the TPLF, he noted, adding those countries informed the Ethiopian government. Those countries, which we cannot name, told us they declined Tedros's requests, saying the conflict was an internal Ethiopian affair and they stand with us, he said. The official said from what they have gathered, Tedros was serving as a full-time diplomat of the TPLF, breaching the duties of the Director General of the WHO. We are readying a protest note to the WHO and other relevant bodies, the official added. Ethiopia has launched what it describes as a law enforcement operation in Tigray after forces of the TPLF attacked the northern command of the federal army stationed across the Tigray region, killing soldiers and looting military assets. The TPLF dominated political life in Ethiopia for more than 3 decades before current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who hails from the Oromo ethnic group, came to power in 2018. The Oromo is the largest ethnic tribe in Ethiopia, representing around 34.9% of the country's population of 114.9 million, while the Tigray account for only 7.3%. Ethiopia issues arrest warrants for generals, officers. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Federal Police Commission issued arrest warrants Wednesday for 76 army generals and officers. The commission said those in question were involved in an attack 2 weeks ago on an Ethiopian army's northern command and ensuing sabotages. Forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front attacked the northern command in Tigray on the 4th of November. The Ethiopian army has since launched what has been described as law enforcement operations. There is, however, no end in sight to the violence as humanitarian situations are reported to have deteriorated.
Ethiopian army is closing in on Tigray capital, minister says. Our defense forces are moving forward and closing in on Mekelle, Redwan Hussein, Ethiopia's State Minister of Foreign Affairs and spokesman for the government's emergency task force, told reporters in the capital, Addis Ababa. There are a number of towns that have fallen. Ethiopian government forces are closing in on the capital of the dissident Tigray region, where fighting that erupted on the 4th of November has left hundreds of people dead and sparked a humanitarian crisis. The government has dispatched 2 fact-finding missions to Tigray to assess the extent of the humanitarian crisis, Redwan said. The government is trying to find routes and to find safe corridors for humanitarian aid, he said, adding that the situation is being impeded by Tigray forces destroying bridges providing access to the region. Biden's foreign policy aide urges end to fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray region. U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's foreign policy aide on Thursday urged an end to fighting in North Ethiopia, where federal troops are battling rebels and pushing toward the regional capital. A 2-week-old war in the Tigray region has killed hundreds, sent 30,000 refugees into Sudan and called into question whether Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, Africa's youngest leader and last year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, can hold his fractured nation together ahead of national elections next year. Hundreds of foreign aid workers have left Tigray, warning of a spiraling crisis in an area where hundreds of thousands of people relied on food aid even before the fighting. Deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia, reports of targeted ethnic violence, and the risk to regional peace and security, tweeted Antony Blinken, a veteran diplomat and longtime Biden confidant. Africa's second most populous nation with 115 million people, Ethiopia is a federation of 10 states run by separate ethnic groups. The war has pitted the central government against one of the most heavily militarized regions. The Northern Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, effectively ruled Ethiopia for decades as the strongest force in a multi-ethnic coalition, until Abiy took power 2 years ago. Ethiopia is a major U.S. ally whose soldiers serve in peacekeeping missions in South Sudan and Somalia. Its military and intelligence services are among the most capable in Africa. The TPLF and Ethiopian authorities should take urgent steps to end the conflict, enable humanitarian access, and protect civilians, added Blinken, who is expected to play a senior role in the incoming U.S. administration. On the ground, the TPLF leader said his soldiers still held the important town of Axum, though they had lost Shira's federal troops aimed for the state capital Mekelle. Assertions by all sides have been impossible to verify because internet and phone connections to Tigray have been suspended and the government has restricted access. Atrocities. An Ethiopian government statement referred to reports of ethnic killings in the town of Maykadra, documented by Amnesty International last week. Survivors told the rights group that militias affiliated to the Tigray government killed scores or even hundreds of civilians. The TPLF has denied involvement. We would like to remind the leaders of this group that the atrocities that have been committed by their forces and loyalists in places like Maykadra constitute serious crimes, the government statement said, using an alternative spelling. Ethiopian federal forces are trying to advance along main roads from the south and the northwest of Mekelle and were around 200 kilometers, 124 miles, from the Tigrayan capital, a diplomat monitoring the conflict said. The military accused World Health Organization (WHO) head Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, a Tigrayan, of trying to procure arms and diplomatic backing for the TPLF. They offered no evidence for the accusations and there was no immediate response from Tedros. He held ministerial posts for a decade in Ethiopia's TPLF-led governing coalition before being elected the WHO's first African leader in 2017. The conflict has also embroiled Ethiopia's neighbors. The TPLF fired rockets at Eritrea last weekend. Sudan is receiving refugees. In Somalia, Ethiopia has removed weapons from ethnic Tigrayan soldiers in its peacekeeping contingent. Tigrayans make up just 5% of Ethiopia's population but had outsourced political power for decades after TPLF guerrillas led a revolution in 1991. Abiy, whose parents are from the much larger Oromo and Amhara ethnic groups, became premier in 2018 and began opening up both the economy and a repressive political system. He won last year's Nobel for ending a long-running conflict with Eritrea, but since then his government has overseen curbs on the media and mass arrests after periods of deadly unrest. He has so far rebuffed calls for talks over Tigray. The government denies any ethnic undertones to the offensive, saying it is a law and order operation necessary to maintain unity.
Not too late to stop the Ethiopian civil war from becoming a broader ethnic conflict. Western and regional powers are more divided than they were during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. But they can still exert influence to prevent the fragmentation of Ethiopia's federal system. Florian Bieber, November 18, 2020. Over the past 2 years, Ethiopia seemed like Africa's greatest success story. After Abiy Ahmed became prime minister, The country opened up to the opposition, allowed exiled politicians to return, and ended the long-standing war with Eritrea. The rapid transformation earned Abiy a Nobel Peace Prize. However, this image has become tarnished in recent weeks by the escalating conflicts with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which had long disproportionately dominated the federal government and the erstwhile ruling coalition, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and has a reputation for iron-fisted rule and fomenting inter-ethnic violence as its principal source of power. The current military confrontation also threatens to undo the progress made in recent years. Many commentators have noted that there is a long history of violent repression of ethnic groups and regions in Ethiopia. It might thus not be surprising to many that Abiy is also resorting to violence to confront the rebellious TPLF, a party that, due to its decades of domination of the federal government, has many enemies. However, it would be simple to reduce the brewing conflict to a simple desire to assert centralized power. As we argued last year in foreign policy, Yugoslavia holds some important lessons for Ethiopia. The combination of an ethnic federation and democratization, coupled with dormant or unresolved ethnic grievances, provides for a volatile mix. Already during the early phase of Ethiopia's transformation, there were some ominous signs, such as ethnic cleansing in parts of the country and fragmentation of political competition along ethnic lines. Because Ethiopia has a longer tradition of statehood than Yugoslavia did at the time of its breakup, and with ethnically defined regions seeking greater autonomy, rather than independence, the preconditions were better in Ethiopia than in Yugoslavia for managing the shift toward a multi-party system. The violent confrontation between the federal government and the TPLF bodes ill for the country. However, once violence becomes a means to address disputes, it is hard to stop, and demands for autonomy quickly escalate toward claims for independence. In Yugoslavia, only Slovenia and Croatia initially sought independence. However, once violence escalated and others feared being stuck in a much reduced state with a changing balance of power, other republics also opted to leave the federation. With some 110 million inhabitants and potential conflicts that could draw in several of its neighbors, the dangers in Ethiopia are too great to ignore, with the exception of the TPLF, which appears to have lost hope of retaining power at the federal level. Almost all political parties apart from a few radical groups have been supportive of the transition and its principal architect, the Prime Minister. Abiy and his administration were widely popular, and the government's early steps were encouraging, such as the inclusion of women in government and the opening up toward critical public debates. All signs were that a successful transformation might be possible. Today, the picture is much less encouraging. A mixture of greed and incompetence at the local and regional levels, coupled with increasing tensions and belligerence, has thrown doubt on the successful transformation. There are several challenges Abiy's government has encountered, all associated with difficulties of the country's ethnic federalism, both in terms of its design and its reality. To understand those design flaws, some historical background is necessary. When a coalition of different rebel armies led by Meles Zenawi and the TPLF overthrew the communist Derg government in 1991, the rebels established a federal state, with its units corresponding to the largest ethnic groups in the country and governed by a coalition of ethnic-based parties. The TPLF dominated the state, despite the Tigrayans accounting for only around 6% of Ethiopia's population. The ethnic federal system was largely modeled on the communist design of ethnic federalism, similar to Yugoslavia. By imperfectly aligning ethnicity to territory, it sought to address competing ethnic group interests but also controlled them through an authoritarian system. Once authoritarian rule lost its grip, the main units and actors emerging into a liberalized political arena were based along ethnic lines, and there was little space for political competition over ideas rather than ethnicity. In Yugoslavia, the nationalist politicians became vessels for extremist nationalist messaging, mutually reinforcing each other. The rise of Croatian nationalist President Franjo Tuđman was a direct response to Serbian strongman Slobodan Milosevic's claims to greater Serb dominance. As each side made more nationalist claims, the middle ground, as well as parties that focused on economic and social problems, were increasingly pushed aside. The danger is similar in Ethiopia, where regional structures are defined along ethnic lines. All political competition will therefore be ethnic. There are four primary risks to a federalist Ethiopian state at the moment: ethnic identity as the sole political agenda, ethnically motivated attacks, and silence and inaction by regional and local authorities. which should take the leading role in containing them, the issue of self-determination to regional statehood, which has caused tension in the country's south, and the conflict between the TPLF and the federal government. While the latter has gathered the most international attention in recent weeks, it is not the only challenge Ethiopia is facing. The greatest damage to the Ethiopian state that the TPLF did during its years in power was to entrench the dominance of ethnicity in almost all public and private affairs. Facts depend on ethnicity. Prosecutions depend on ethnicity. Ethnicity has become the greatest unwritten defense of criminal prosecutions, and political and public offices are sought and granted on the basis of ethnicity. This has not just undermined meritocracy but also rendered the emergence of meaningful cross-ethnic political competition difficult. Worst of all, the ethnic political parties dominating the political space, with few exceptions, appear to stake their potential gain of political power on ethnicity, invoking past and present ethnic resentments, with little effort to explain the economic and socio-political benefits that they would bring if they rose to power. Ethnically motivated attacks and atrocities have increased, with the attackers claiming innocence while demonizing and accusing others of all sorts of past and present atrocities. Recent ethnically motivated attacks in the south, western Oromia, and Benishangul Gumuz, resulting in civilian deaths, destruction of their belongings, displacement, and insecurity, have made this clear. Most worrying, there are few constitutional and neutral means to prevent and prosecute such attacks by the federal government. Sometimes, citizens are hopelessly relying on those local authorities that are complicit in most of the criminal activities. One of the daunting challenges facing Abiy's administration has been the increasing number of requests for regional statehood, which the Ethiopian constitution allows with no regard to socio-economic, political, or any other benefits. The claims by more than a dozen zonal administrations, which operate at a lower level than regional statehood, in the south to become regional states are worrying, because there are no efforts to show that statehood would meaningfully benefit ordinary citizens. Indeed, those groups are exercising self-administration at zonal level. A change in status giving them statehood would have few tangible benefits. Local administrators do not seem to care about this risk of fragmentation or the multiple territorial conflicts that might arise from claims of territorial self-administration in this precarious time of transition. For them, due to the perceived weakness of the federal government, this is an opportune time to make claims for new regional statehood. A very generous offer of self-determination enshrined in the constitution used to be held in check through the cartel of dominant parties, controlled by the TPLF. What was once a tool to accommodate competing demands and empower marginalized groups has ballooned out of control, with demands for self-rule often posing a threat to regional minorities. The Tigray regional administrator's hostility to the central government is a unique case and has different drivers. Since the TPLF lost power, it has literally retreated to the regional state of Tigray, refusing federal law enforcement, issuing incessant condemnation of Abiy and his administration, and totally rejecting his government as illegal. It was the only party in the ruling coalition of ethnic parties that refused to join Abiy's newly created Prosperity Party. Instead, it organized regional elections despite objections by the federal government and in breach of Ethiopian laws. If governmental reports are accurate, the TPLF has brazenly sought a military confrontation with the federal government, which the TPLF claims to be a preemptive strike. The TPLF's attempt to go to war at this moment might be a grand miscalculation. The TPLF's attempt to go to war at this moment might be a grand miscalculation. The TPLF has been administering the region with no rivals, before or since the elections. While it withdrew from the federal government, it remains fully in control in its region while losing little at the federal level, since the ascent of Abiy had already shifted the balance of power in Addis Ababa away from the TPLF. Indeed, considering the ethnic system of governance it established, the TPLF must know it will never again be able to hold a dominant position at the federal level in a democratic environment. Increasing its power at the federal level has not been an option, as it lacks the resources and circumstances that brought it to power nearly 3 decades ago. Secession is also not a realistic option, being squeezed between Ethiopia and hostile Eritrea and with no prospects of recognition. The escalation in recent months and weeks appears to have been aimed at achieving de facto independence, namely securing undisturbed self-rule in Tigray and ignoring the federal government. It is difficult to predict what comes next. As many observers had argued, the risks of an all-out war are great for both the TPLF and the government. The TPLF might be militarily well equipped and motivated to defend its base, but the small size of Tigray and considerable resentment toward the party elsewhere in the country make it vulnerable. The government risks becoming bogged down in a protracted conflict it cannot win easily. A military escalation has revealed less democratic and more military instincts on both sides, and the war risks undoing much of the opening up the country experienced in recent years. Arguably, a constitutional revision will be necessary to find a new balance between the federal government and regions, including removing the right to secession, introducing reasonable grounds for territorial autonomy, and ensuring the enforcement of constitutional rights of ordinary citizens in all regions and places, including through the use of federal law enforcement organs. But pushing through such amendments are difficult in the current context. No less important is addressing the legitimacy crisis the federal government is encountering owing to human rights violations with impunity all across the country. Serious violations, including ethnically motivated killings and displacement, are going unchecked and unpunished. The Abiy administration appears to place all the blame on the TPLF and its accomplices, but this does not address the full scope of Ethiopia's problems. Serious violations, including ethnically motivated killings and displacement, are going unchecked and unpunished. The Abiy administration appears to place all the blame on the TPLF and its accomplices, but this does not address the full scope of Ethiopia's problems. Regional, zonal, and local authorities, often far from Tigray, in some cases have shown utter incompetence and complicity, and the central government must take responsibility and address these problems by listening to the grievances of victimized groups. To accomplish this, building institutional trust will be crucial. Trust in governmental institutions, trust in the media, and trust among communities, instead of relying on extremely vocal groups that currently appear to be living in alternative realities. There has been little help from the outside in de-escalating the current conflict and ensuring that Ethiopia remains a success story rather than following in the bloody footsteps of Yugoslavia. There are limited options for the international community. It is weaker and more divided than in the 1990s, when it failed to end the Yugoslav wars for years before intervening. Sending a clear message that reported massacres and war crimes against civilians will not be ignored and should be investigated would be a start. And while the military response of the Ethiopian federal government is understandable and necessary to keep the country from falling apart, foreign powers must pressure Abiy to act with restraints to avoid transforming the confrontation with the TPLF into a wider and more drawn-out ethnic conflict. Florian Bieber is a professor of Southeast European history and politics and Jean Monnet Chair for the Europeanization of Southeastern Europe at the University of Graz, Austria. He is the author of Debating Nationalism.